Hi, my name is Mia Armstrong Lopez, and I'm a managing editor at ASU Media Enterprise and one of the editors behind the Future Tense Fiction series, which you can now read in Issues in Science and Technology. I'm really excited to be joined today by Cassidy McFadzean. Cassidy is the author of 3 books of poetry, most recently Crying Dress. Her fiction has appeared in Joyland and is forthcoming in Hazlitt, The Walrus, and in Dead Writers. She's also the author of Patrons, which is October's Future Tense Fiction story. Cassidy, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited.
Yeah, so to start, I wanted to ask you to describe, if you can, in one sentence or like maybe maximum 2 sentences, what Patrons is about.
Wow. I would say it's about what if you were plucked from the earth and taken to a planet where all your needs were met in exchange for writing a poem for your patron every day. That's sort of the gist of the story.
Yeah, and that gives us a lot of jumping off points, and there's a lot of things that I want to dig into there. But maybe just to build off of that, I'm really curious about if you could take us into sort of the feelings or circumstances or ponderings that brought you to that, like, what if for patrons.
Yeah, I guess for me, I got really into UFOs for a while and like browsing the UFO subreddits. And for a while, it seemed like disclosure was imminent and like we were finally going to find out like what all these unidentified objects were. And that never really happened, but I was still, while I was still in the UFO brain mindset. Yeah, this piece sort of came to me, combined with the image of almost the Bosch-like orbs that appear to pluck the humans away to this other planet. So it was sort of those two things, that obsession with UFOs, and then these yeah, jewel-like orbs that come and pluck the humans away. And I think the opening line as well, which references, when the patrons first appeared, we were not thinking about our jollies. This idea of like, okay, what are these jollies? Sort of a way to describe small joys in life that sort of reappears throughout the piece. So yeah, having fun with language in that way as well. I kind of wanted to put all those things together.
Yeah, no, I love that. And ever since I read this story, I have been thinking about it in that way. Like, what are my jollies for the day, right? Like in the story, like sometimes the jollies can come from like gummy candy or like watching like dance videos on the internet. But when the patrons like grab the folks that they lift off of Earth, there's a point where the protagonist kind of explains like, oh, they didn't have to think about their jollies after that because they were sort of brought to this planet that is like full of jollies, at least in the short term, and then like things become more complicated. But it actually sort of brings me to like a would you rather question that I wanted to ask you, which is like, would you want to be chosen by the patrons? Because there's sort of a debate between the protagonist and her coworker, Stephanie. So the protagonist's coworker like says she wouldn't want to be chosen by the patrons. She worries about leaving her children. Like at some point in the story, that gets a little bit more complicated.
Mhm.
The protagonist herself like says at first that she doesn't really think that you can choose whether you're chosen or not, or once you're chosen, maybe they ask you if you want to go, but is that really a choice? Because who could say no to that? And when the protagonist actually is chosen, she does agree to leave, and ultimately has some mixed feelings about it. So yeah, so what if you were in that position? Would you want to be kind of swept away to a different planet?
I mean, yeah, it would definitely be hard to resist, but I think I'm a bit of a homebody for Earth, so I might have to, I don't know. I was actually thinking when I was also writing the piece, I've spent a lot of time away from home, and I think anyone who goes away for school, I spent 2 years in the US for my MFA, and I'm from Canada, so you're sort of I was thinking of the fact that I was sort of plucked away from my home and taken to this, amazing MFA where you get to make art and sort of be in community with other people, was sort of a similarity to what I not, not all your needs are met, but you do have to say goodbye to, some of your friends in your community at home. So that was something that I was interested in exploring, and sort of these art communities that we have. Even I go away for like retreats quite often, and sort of thinking about those dynamics, like what are the circumstances that allow us to create art? And if you're being taken out of your community, sort of how does that impact your art? Are you still able to create, or does that sort of take away from your motivation in some ways? So I don't know if the artists on like Mars or any planet would be as motivated to make art in the future. We'll have to find out.
Yeah, well, it's really interesting, and it's actually one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about, because I think one of the major themes of the story is that, like what you're describing, like the creativity economy, and what is sort of the infrastructure or the circumstances that we need to
Mhm.
create art. There's a part of the story where the protagonist's coworker Stephanie asks if the patron's planet is like some sort of artist retreat, and the protagonist is like, yeah, essentially. And so it sort of like plays with these dualities, right? Because on the one hand, when the protagonist is taken away from our planet and she doesn't have to work 8 hours about at a library and worry about the mold in her house and worry how, like, if her dad is healthy and all of these sorts of like earthly kind of worries and concerns and routines, she's able to sort of create poetry and create art on this other planet. But then she also has this pull back toward her community that you're describing. So I'm just wondering, like, what you think the story says about what what we need within the infrastructure to be able to make art.
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. Yeah, I was sort of thinking about like, I mean, even granting bodies or patrons in real life, even if they're offering you an opportunity or financial help, it's never really an equal exchange. You sort of owe them something, whether it's your art or your presence or showing up at a fundraiser or, allowing them to use your image. So I was sort of thinking about those elements, but in terms of what allows us to create art, I definitely think it is about, at least for me, sustaining a practice really involves being in community and that sort of thing. So whether the protagonist is able to find that community of others who are plucked away to this planet remains uncertain, right? It kind of goes a strange direction where they almost get yeah, plugged into their devices more than maybe they'd like to be. Yes, I'm not quite sure, but I was definitely interested in exploring those ideas.
Yeah, it's a really like interesting theme. What you mentioned is like what is quote unquote owed to the people who
Hmm.
patronize or sponsor art in some ways, right? Like in the story, the protagonist patron kind of comes every day and she has to sort of show them what she has produced. And there's this point where she's sort of going through some emotional turmoil and she's worried that sort of she's produced something kind of sad and she's worried that that's going to sort of upset or not please her patron. But the patron actually seems to be like even more pleased by this like show of emotion. So then it's like, yeah, it's sort of these dynamics where one must sort of bare their soul to the world because the world feels like it's owed that as a part of the artistic process. I don't know, it's just a really rich exploration I think that the story has there.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, especially thinking of like poetry, confessional poetry, or people that write from real life, like memoirs. I haven't written any nonfiction, but I imagine that dynamic would be quite fragile where you want to, I don't know, maybe sometimes the publishers even might not have your interests at heart if they're interested in selling books or that sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah. And so one of the other sort of threads within the story, and you started to talk about this, is sort of the interaction between creativity and connectedness. And this is going to be like a little bit of a spoiler, so you can turn it off if you haven't read the story yet. But what happens when like internet, quote unquote, internet arrives at the art retreat? I mean, it's not necessarily like the full internet, like you and I would have Google. Sort of the people who are on the patron's planet have to like do this labor to patch together slowly like different parts of the internet. But it was interesting because this is something that like both the characters and particularly the protagonist like craves, but then also kind of torments them in some way, which I think is probably similar to how a lot of us feel about the internet. But when it happens toward the end of the story, it actually reminded me of a quote that really stuck with me from earlier in the story, which was when the patrons first arrived to Earth, and the protagonist is like describing how everyone on Earth is sort of enamored with the patrons and really wants to go to the patrons to their like marvelous world. And she says, like, we began to look at our world differently, knowing that a better one was possible. So it's sort of this sentiment that there's like a classic grass is always greener sentiment that is like often mediated by the internet. And then it sort of then migrates its way toward the patron's planet, right? Because the people who are on the patron's planet begin looking at their previous world differently, kind of with these changed circumstances and craving it in some ways. So I was just wondering how you were thinking about sort of the intersection between connectivity and creativity in the story, and just like how being able to perceive other people's lives and worlds on the internet like affects our own visions of what we want and what is possible.
Yeah, I mean, often it can be, or at least maybe ideally, can be quite inspiring to see what others are producing in terms of art or, yeah, in terms of new developments or working together or even working together in terms of protest and those sorts of things. But I feel like, yeah, too often I fall into the trap of just, doom scrolling, phone addiction, obsessively. Yeah, it's not a healthy relationship, I think, that I have to my phone. And people are separating from that now. You see people with, using flip phones are making a comeback. I think for me in the story, I was definitely interested in capturing that dynamic or having some fun with it, but also sort of the nostalgia that the internet can give one. A lot of my memories of being a teenager, are like websites that no longer exist or, trying to find an old house on like Google Maps. So yeah, I think there's this like spooky nostalgia that the internet or sections of the internet used to be able to offer that I'm not even sure exists anymore. But yeah, in the piece, I think it's probably more harmful than a positive presence.
Yeah, it's really interesting there what you're mentioning, because I think that use of the internet is sort of like an archive for who we were or what our world
Mhm.
was is really intriguing. And the protagonist is like spending a lot of time like on Google Earth View or like Google Maps, like looking at sort of old geographic pieces of her childhood that were important or sentimental to her in some way. Like I even found myself, I remember during the pandemic, I would find myself looking a lot at like old calendars, like digital calendars,
Mm,
like my Google Calendar from the past. Like, what was I doing this year? Like on this day in a year in the past, and sort of this is like a fragmented version of like what life
yeah.
was like back then. But I think sort of when we find those pieces that are sort of hidden within digital archives, it can be really like enticing for our imaginations, I think.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And maybe also that probably a lot of that won't be preserved, right? It will be lost to the ephemera or of the internet. I'm not sure if there are. I know there are archivists preserving, but I'm sure not maybe our Google calendars or,
I
those sorts of things.
Yeah, it's like it brings us back to the question of like what is worth preserving, and what is a digital artifact that
Hmm.
sort of adds value. So well, I'm sure that I could talk with you about these themes for much longer, but thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about patrons. And patrons is available along with an accompanying expert response essay in Issues in Science and Technology at issues.org. Cassidy, thank you so much.
Thank you.